Welcome to Science of Slink, the evidence-based pole podcast with me, your host, Dr. Rosy. And just to be very clear, I'm not a medical doctor. I cannot treat or diagnose. I'm the type of doctor that does research and reads research articles. And that's part of what we're going to be doing together here in the podcast. We're going to be reading research. We're going to be synthesizing that down into things that you can apply to your pole practice. We're going to be talking with experts in their field and learning more. And overall, just really building our understanding of how bodies work, how we can do pole better, train more effectively, train more safely, and just have a better time overall. So if that sounds like something you're interested in and you want to come get a little bit nerdy with us, come on in. All right. Today, we're going to be talking about something that's very topical right now, and that is, should pole be in the Olympics? And I'm going to argue pretty stringently that I don't think that it should. I don't think that is a good use of our time or effort as a field. And also, I think that the sort of assumption of positive effects is absolutely not borne out by the research. So let's get into it. #science. And I will say that I am not coming at this from a clean state. I think something that, especially those of you who've been listening to the podcast for a while will know, is that I very much want to be a good ally and supporter of sex workers and strippers. I think that their contributions to just society in a whole in general are generally good. And I would love for everybody working in that field to have a better quality of life and more safety and just a nice time all around, right? Like great working conditions. That would be fantastic. I'd really like that. And that is inextricably tied up with the discussion of whether or not pole should be in the Olympics for historical reasons. So let's get into it. I think that there's a number of questions that we can ask about getting pole into the Olympics. And I know that many people feel very strongly about this and feel very strongly that it's a good idea and they want it. My goal here is not to say that they are unilaterally wrong. My goal here is to provide information about why I have my stance. So if you're like, yes, pole, Olympics, I'm super into it, go, go, go. I'm not here to make you feel bad. I want to explain why I feel the way that I feel about this. And part of the way that I feel about this comes from my sort of situation in, wanting things to be good for sex workers. So with that, let's hop on in. So I think the first thing that we should probably do is talk a little bit about the history of this movement. So it's been going on for quite a while at this point. I know that there's a couple distinct organizations. I'm going to be honest, I have not done a lot of deep research into the process itself, but I do know that pole has been moved to observer status, which means that potentially here's the thing, I hesitate to call it a sport. Potentially if as a body of movers and a community of practice, we hit all of the main requirements for inclusion, that potentially it could be considered for inclusion in the actual Olympics. And unfortunately, a lot of that sort of thrust has been tied up with historically. And again, I'm not saying that this is individual people's beliefs, but it is sort of the way the rhetoric has gone and the way that it often is discussed sort of online has been tied up with intentionally trying to distance pole from stripping specifically, right? So a lot of times people who are, very on board, the trying to get into the Olympics will often bring up Chinese pole or, Indian traditions, movement traditions, and try to really distance themselves from stripping, even though pole dance as we know it, certainly in the United States and Australia and Canada and, Europe and South America also, to my understanding, places that I'm less familiar with, really does come from the American tradition of stripping and not the tradition of Chinese pole, or I think Malakab is what the Indian sort of related movement tradition is. And those are great movement traditions. If you want to do Chinese pole, by all means, go and do Chinese pole. I do not think that there is as concerted an effort to get other aerial disciplines into the Olympics as there is for pole, and we'll come back to that. I think there's a reason for that. So again, unfortunately, and I'm not saying that this is the stance of everyone who thinks pole should be in the Olympics, but there is this association between that push and people who are very supportive of that push, and also people who are trying to distance themselves, who are pole dancers, from pole dancers who are also strippers and the origins of the movement. And there's a Washington Post article. I'll post all these in the show notes. You can go and look at it from 2017, because this is when the last big discussion happened, that I think just really encapsulates a lot of this. This is by Marissa Payne, Payne, and to my knowledge, not a pole dancer, but sort of this discussion sort of encapsulates the way that it gets talked about a lot. So there's there's an image of somebody doing pole. They're wearing like a long skirt, and the caption says, "Pole dancing is emerging as a sport and clean in more ways than one. Their clothes stay on, and top-level participants must comply with the World Anti-Doping Agency standards." So, I think not doping is great. I think in general, for example, like long-term anabolic steroid use is not good for your body, and you probably shouldn't be doing it. Just like as a fitness professional, I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. But also like the implication that, when pole involves stripping, it is dirty and less than and bad and negative, right? And the first line of this article is "No strip club necessary." So there's this very clear sort of like, you thought pole was about stripping, but actually it's about other things, and we're really trying to create the sense of distance and separation in sport pole and stripping, which I think, is shitty. Just a real betrayal of the origins of the sport. And again, if you were thinking about it as a sport, which I'm not 100% sure I'm on board with. And I think also it's really disingenuous, right? Like, part of what draws people to pole is that it is sexy, is that its association with stripping, is that sort of slightly taboo nature. And that's something that, studio owners directly profit off of, right? Like, that is part of what gets people into pole for most pole studios. And I mean, I teach online, so this is not a thing for me, but for most pole studios, one of their biggest income streams is bachelorette parties. And why do people do bachelorette parties at pole studios? Because it's sexy, and they're trying to do things that are sexy and taboo, right? So and again, I'm not saying that this is every single person, but, if we sort of look at pole as a field, it's really shitty to be like, oh, it's this sexy, fun, taboo thing you can do, and like taking the money from bachelorette parties with one hand, and then with the other hand being like, oh, but we're not like strippers, we're better than them, and really playing into this sort of pastiche of whorephobia, which, yeah, just not a great thing to do. It doesn't sit right with me, kind of rankles me, and also rankled a lot of other people as well. So I've posted a couple more pieces in the notes if you want to go and read them by various people. And there's also this association with, if you were around a while ago, the hashtag not a stripper or hashtag yes a stripper discussion. And there is, of course, the Yes a Stripper podcast, which I definitely go recommend listening to if you are interested in anything in this sort of topic. So people's feelings get riled because we have this larger pastiche. And I do want to say, I get it. I get that it can be challenging to do something, especially if you're in the US, we're a very puritanical society. Doing something that is sex work adjacent does come with risks and problems, right? Like, people who are not strippers have gotten fired, especially teachers, because it came to light that they pole danced. A great example for me, it's hard to find insurance if you are running a pole studio, not just because of, sort of it's a risky activity, but also covering against like liability insurance, sexual harassment claims. There's sort of this assumption that they're just going to be much more likely at a pole studio because it is sex work adjacent. Those are genuine problems that people face, right? The stigma is a genuine problem that people face, but to me, my belief is that the problem there is that sex workers are facing stigma, and that we should address that stigma, not that you are receiving stigma because you are being associated with sex workers, and then the goal there is to distance yourselves from sex workers, right? And if that really is genuine your goal, don't do pole. I'm dead serious. Like, do something else with your body. If it is a genuine harm for you to be even tangentially associated with something that is related to sex work, don't do a movement form developed by sex workers. Don't try to claim that the movement form doesn't have a link with sex work, because it does. And this is just my personal strongly held opinion, and if you strongly disagree with it, probably you're not going to want to take class with me. Probably I'm not going to be a great fit for you as an instructor. So that's the background. That's why people's emotions are going to be high. That's why my emotions are high. But this is Science of Slink. So I think that it's very relevant to be like, okay, I think it's a bad thing. I just sort of am not on board with the general aims of the program to begin with. But what does the evidence say about being put into the Olympics? What does that do to a sport? What are the effects of an Olympic sport, or sport becoming an Olympic sport, on the people who are doing it? And the answer is, if you are looking at people who are doing it for fun, which is the majority of pole dancers, it's sort of neutral to negative seems to be the general consensus from the research to my understanding. So one thing that you may be like is like, oh, we got to get pole in the Olympics because then a lot more people are going to want to do pole, right? And so there was a study done after the 2012 Olympics in London by Matani et al. And they were sort of looking at like, okay, is this true? Does the Olympics make people want to do sport more? Do we see an overall increase in recreational activity and people doing that sort of thing? And the answer is no. So to quote from them, little evidence of an increased uptake of sporting activity following an Olympic Games event. So in terms of, marketing pole as a sport, we may see, potentially some effects, particularly around sort of that first like, oh, it's in the Olympics, now people are excited about it. But in general, the Olympics don't seem to create more opportunities, don't seem to create more desire for people to do sport. So, and this I think is probably the most relevant for us. So this is Barry's 2011 dissertation by Catherine Ilona Barry, The Effects of Olympic Inclusion on Sport, the Case of Trampolining in England. So I think this is probably the most directly relevant to what we're talking about here. And the sort of positives were, again, talking to people in this community that they saw, themselves as doing an activity that suddenly had more status, especially because other related disciplines had been in the Olympics and trampoline wasn't, and there was sort of like a little power differential there. But if we're talking about recreational, just people who are doing it for fun, quote, few benefits from trampolining being in the Olympic program filter down to the recreational and school levels of the sports, and those that have tend to be indirect impacts. So it really only affects people who are already at the elite level. Basically was the main findings from this study, which again, it's a dissertation, it is long, but if you're looking for like a deep case study of like what happens when your sport gets put in the Olympics, like if you're doing it for fun, nothing much. Maybe people send you like videos once every 4 years where they're like, hey, why aren't you in the Olympics? But it doesn't really have that big of an effect, like a big positive effect on the, the people who are doing the sport in the first place. Or again, and sport broadly here. I should point out also that being in the Olympics is not what makes something a sport, right? So things that I think unquestionably most people would agree are sports aren't in the Olympics. So a great example is that there's no softball and there's no baseball in the 2024 Olympics. They are just not being held. And what sports get held at specific Olympic events, there's quite a bit of discretion of the specific host country as well. So my understanding is that the reason that breakdancing is in the Olympics is because France really wanted breakdancing to be in the Olympics. And that was at least a large part of the process. So something to keep in mind, like if what you want to claim is that pole dancing is a sport and you want a specific thing to point to and you want that specific thing to be, it's in the Olympics, I don't think it's not going to be compelling evidence for the people who are already dead set on it not being a sport. And inclusion in the Olympics is not necessary for something to be considered a sport, if that makes sense. That's the argument I'm trying to make there. There is evidence, and this is a really interesting meta-study by DeReich and DeBoscher, 2019, in the International Journal of Sports Policy and Politics, mapping the potential societal impacts triggered by elite sport, a conceptual framework. So they went through and they looked at a bunch of different studies around elite sport, and what they found is, again, I'm quoting here, since the turn of the century, a growing number of empirical studies have increased the realization that elite sport do not automatically initiate positive societal impacts. Moreover, the various dark sides of elite sport seem to be underestimated. And some of the specific ones that they brought up were sexism, exploitation, discrimination, injuries, and distorted body image. And there's a whole big table where they go through and they're like, here's the things that people sort of assume will happen, that we don't have good evidence always happens. And they sort of, there's a lot of assumptions that it's an unmitigated good, and there's an underestimation of the negative effects, right? And one thing that I will point out is that the Olympics do really care a lot about gender, and I don't know if you knew this, but pole as an activity is not actually very gender equal. It does have quite a strong gender bias, and that's probably going to, if it ever does get in the Olympics, that's going to be something to keep in mind, right? There's probably just, first of all, there's going to be the cisgender essentialism issues that the Olympics have had since the, don't want to get too sidetracked, but basically this is going to be an exclusionary thing for people who are not sufficiently cis in a way that the International Olympic Committee is trying to define it currently. And also there's probably just going to be proportionally a lot more available space for men than women, which again is how the Olympics divides things. So it's absolutely going to, you know, create inequalities in a gender sense within pole. So that's the research. The research is that there's not really much benefit to, you know, small businesses in the field. There's not really much benefit to individual movers in the field, and that people tend to really underestimate the negative effects of taking, you know, sports to the elite level. And again, all this is in the show notes if you want to learn more. Which, I mean, to me, that's not honestly, it's not a compelling argument for the existence of elite sports, but that's a separate thing, right? That is a whole separate discussion, but I don't know that pole needs to be among them, you know? And then I think the question we have to ask is like, okay, who's going to be harmed, right? Like I sort of mentioned trans folks absolutely going to be excluded from this. Just sort of blanket statement, the Olympics is pretty cis-sexist, let's put it that way. And this has been a major problem specifically for women of color, and that includes cis women of color, right? So that is opening up a vector of harm. Also, and again, I don't think that everyone who thinks that the Olympics pole should be in the Olympics is horphobic. That is not what I'm saying. I am saying that that is the wider narrative, and that that's going to be something that is probably going to cause, you know, mental distress to sex workers and strippers, and may lead to even further marginalization. And I think there's a big question that I really want to ask people who are very, very focused on wanting pole to be in the Olympics and wanting pole to be a quote unquote real sport. Then I have this sort of just question in general for folks who want things that I think traditionally probably wouldn't have been considered sports to be considered sports. Why? Why is it important to you that something is considered to be a sport and not a movement practice or a recreational activity or an artistic pursuit? What is it about sports specifically that makes you focused on having that as a label that you can apply to your activity? And I think part of it may be the assumption that if something is a sport, it will be easier to get funding. It'll be easier perhaps to get customers. You know, you get access to a, you know, wider variety of resources for whatever it is that you're doing. But I don't actually think that that's true, right? Like if we look at, you know, sort of the amount of work and support that's been done around pole dancers in sort of a research sense, and then the amount of research that's been done on sort of circus artists and aerialists more generally, to date there is just more work on circus and aerialists more generally, even though there are more recreational pole dancers than there are recreational aerialists, in part because it's funded, right? And it's funded because circus arts is a performing art that makes money. People go see circus shows, right? Like Cirque du Soleil makes a lot of money, and it is not that it is a sport that gets you those resources. It is being attached to an economic engine. Is that equitable? No. Capitalism, baby. And to be frank, pole is not a horrible economic engine, but most of it does not come from ticket sales. Most of it does not come from performances. On the recreational side, obviously, if we are talking about stripping, then, I mean, even in stripping, right, like most of it is not, you know, at least in the US, to my understanding, is not coming from like people tipping stage shows. It's mostly from people giving private dances. If private dances are allowed where you live, which is not the case everywhere. Whorephobia and blue laws, another separate episode that I am not the person to record, right? But it is the thing that is creating those resources, the things that's creating that support, the things that are creating those institutions are not it being a sport. It is having financial support for those broader activities that would benefit everyone. And I think, especially, you know, I grew up in the US, like my high school didn't have a stage. Like we didn't have an auditorium or stage for doing theater productions, but absolutely we had a football field. You know, we had a football field, right? And that was, you know, unequal providing of resources, but it's not because one thing was a sport and another thing wasn't a sport. It's because funding reflected the values of a certain group of people, and they I think for the most part, we're trying to reflect the values of the community that they were in. And, the Friday night football games, the whole county, well, not the whole county, but lots of folks came out, and there was like a time of community togetherness and socialization as we watched people lose at football. We were not very good, bless us. Listen, they tried. I was in the marching band, so I watched a lot of those games. Anyway, the point that I'm making there is that this is a reflection of a larger societal value system, and it is not because if you are a sport, magically there is money, magically there is support, magically there is, this sense of authenticity. Not authenticity, what am I looking for? Prestige, right? Status. Like that doesn't automatically come when it's a sport. And I think there's kind of an assumption that or maybe a hope that it will. And if that's what we want, I think we're going to have more success more quickly, and we're going to, make more people's lives better if we pursue it other ways, right? And, specific things that I'm thinking about here that personally for me are a more important goal than trying to get people to agree that pole is a sport, which like, again, I don't know that I agree, right? Like for me, the core of pole is improvisational sensual movement. That's not a sport. That's just, it's not. It is a dance practice. It's an artistic practice, and I am fine with that. And I don't need it to be a sport to feel good about myself, But there are definitely things that we can think about. And specifically, if our goal is to be, have status, is to have a lot of the problems that come with being sex work adjacent, is to address the problem that sex workers have, is to address those problems, because that's what the issue is. The issue is not that we are adjacent to sex work. The issue is that, puritanical laws, punitive laws, really regressive social structures make that a socially challenging position to be in, and not that we are kind of close to it as pole dancers, right? You get what I'm saying? So specific things to think about here. One big one is, discrimination by payment processors. So the ACLU right now has a big campaign, American Civil Liberties Union. It's more of a US thing, but I think you can still definitely weigh in if you're outside the US. ACLU right now has a big campaign to sort of pressure MasterCard to stop discriminating against sex workers. Payment processing is a huge safety and, welfare and just straight up being able to survive issue for a lot of sex workers. And guess what? It affects pole folks too. Especially with the advent of machine learning and, automatic classification segmentation, we're lumped in there too. So it is self-serving, but also like it's addressing this underlying problem of discrimination against sex work and puritanical laws, rather than sort of like trying to distance ourselves from the problem, because we're never going to be able to get far away enough from it that people who want us to be lumped into it are not going to lump us into it. You know what I mean? So that's one, payment processors. Huge issue. Another one is decriminalization of sex work more broadly. I know that this is a much bigger topic than I am qualified to talk about. It's going to vary quite a bit locally, but I would recommend, looking up local, regional, national, for wherever it is that you are, sex workers unions, not anti-trafficking organizations specifically led by sex workers that are advocating for their own rights. And at least, certainly the ones that I'm familiar with in the US and the UK, the main focus is on decriminalization rather than legalization, and I would strongly encourage you to do research into that and to advocate for it at the state, local, national level, province, whatever your relevant governmental bodies are. So definitely learn more, educate yourself. And also a specific one that's cropping up that is a huge pain is there's this sort of wave in the US, and I think in other places as well, of age verification bills, where in order to access specific, internet content that various legislatures broadly define as not good for minors, they're required to verify the age of users. So if you've ever seen like that, like pop up, like, are you 18 or older? Not that. I mean, like, you upload a copy of your government ID, or you do biometric data entry, right? So this is where they take, a picture of your face and scan your age, right? Which is incredibly invasive for users. It's also a huge privacy and security nightmare, right? You can't change your biometrics. If someone, hacks a database with your fingerprints in it, and you are using, fingerprint identification to open things, and they 3D print a copy of your fingerprint, guess what? They got access. And you can't change it, right? You can change your passwords. You can't change your fingerprints. You can't change your voice. You can't change your voice print. You can't change your face. You can't change your gait. That's a biometric thing. Anyway, a little bit of an aside there. Or again, government IDs. And this is a huge burden on, businesses as well. Like, I don't want a copy of all my students' government IDs to have on file. I take security best practices very, very seriously, but I don't want to be carrying copies of that very sensitive personal information. I don't want the liability and overhead for that. And also, I don't want to have to ask for it from my students. That's a huge invasion of privacy. I don't want to do it. So pushing back against age verification laws, more broadly, just going to be helpful for a variety of businesses in this space, and also, consumer protection, privacy, and security. So we're in sort of a political cycle right now where things are getting, at least in the US, there's this big regressive swing. There's this big sort of push to lock things down, to make things, anything adjacent to sex work going to be harder. Sesta Fosta, of course, was an enormous harm to so many people, and so much of it sort of invisible and untracked, but not any less harmful for that big legislation that was passed in the US a while ago that was supposed to stop trafficking. The last time I checked, it had never been successfully used in prosecution to stop trafficking. It had resulted in a huge spike of preventable violence against service providers. So that's the sort of thing that I feel like as pole dancers, because we are using this movement discipline because we've benefited from and currently benefit from the labor of sex workers directly and indirectly, should be on the top of our to-do list. And bullying the IOC, I don't care about. I don't think it's going to help, especially. I think we got other more important things to do. I think the evidence suggests that it's not going to be particularly beneficial for recreational pollers or businesses, right? So even just from a business standpoint, not great for me. I think the main people who are going to see any change are going to be people who are already at that level and already competing internationally. Good for them. I'm not saying, I'm going to be devastated if Pole shows up in the Olympics. I'll watch it. Of course I'll watch it. Are you kidding? I'll have opinions. But that said, I don't know that this is the best use of our time and capacity, and our sort of, as a community of practice where we can successfully apply pressure to create societal change. So that's my piece. Again, research down below. Feel free to read it. I think the trampolining paper is probably the most relevant for us. It's a dissertation, so maybe skim it. Maybe don't read the whole thing. But I think I understand where people are coming from. I, too, would like to have a lot of problem solved, but I think that I don't share the sort of underlying idea about what the problem is, and I don't think we're using the same tools. Yeah, I think we all want the same thing, right? We want pole to be taken seriously. We want the people who pole dance, whether or not they're sex workers, to be taken seriously, to be safe, to be well compensated, to have great working conditions and wonderful lives. And I think we can all agree that that is something that we would like. I hope. All right, so that's my piece on pole in the Olympics. I think that there are other better things that we can do, and maybe you disagree, and that is okay. It's okay to have different opinions. So thanks so much for joining me. I know this was 80% opinion, 20% research, but I'm trying to bring in at least some of the research to this discussion because I think it is relevant, and I think most folks aren't familiar with it. I hope this was helpful. I hope it was interesting. I hope it gave you some food for thought. I hope you learned something, and I will talk to you later. Bye. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something. If you want to do more research on your own, if we talked about specific studies, I always try to have the citations in the show notes so you can check them out for yourself. A great place to continue our learning. Speaking of continuing your learning, if you do want to work with me as a pole instructor, I teach online at my online studio, Slink Through Strength, and it would be great to have you come join us. I teach freestyle flow, I teach conditioning, I teach flexibility, and I teach pole in the nerdiest way possible. But we have a good time, and we'd love to have you join us if that sounds like fun for you. And if not, no worries. Either way, I'll see you in the next episode. Have a good one.